Philip, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to chatting.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. Yeah, I've heard about your work and seen you cited in so many papers that I've covered and read over the years. And now we're here to talk about your newest book, Why the Purpose of the Universe, which I've read in the past few days and really enjoyed.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, thank you so much for sending it over, and I recommend for folks to check it out. I'll link in the description below for folks to buy it online. And so, for people who aren't familiar with your work and aren't familiar with the topic of panpsychism, I'd love to set the table and see if you wouldn't mind giving, just a broad overview of what is panpsychism, and then I have a ton of questions to ask you about, diving deeper.
Okay, very good starting point. Panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of reality. So maybe fundamental particles like electrons and quarks have incredibly simple forms of experience, and the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from or derived from those more basic elements. So sounds like a bit of a wacky view, and for a long time this was sort of laughed at insofar as it was thought of at all. But I suppose in the last 10 or 15 years in academic philosophy and even some areas of neuroscience, it's become taken much more seriously as the kind of radical approach we need to deal with consciousness and to bring it into our scientific story of the universe.
Great, yeah, that's awesome, and thank you for making that so succinct. Sometimes people can go on, and we'll dive into the specifics of it. And then the second question, and then we'll dive into panpsychism a little bit more, is what is the thesis of your latest book?
Right, so this is not a book I would have imagined writing actually about 5 years ago. It's been quite a journey. I suppose it's for me. It's always about. I hate the dichotomies, of kind of. Are you in favor of US capitalism or Soviet communism? Are you in favor of materialism or dualism? And one big dichotomy that dominates much of our culture is: do you believe in the God of traditional Western religion, or are you a secular atheist? Who's right, Richard Dawkins or the Pope? And
Sure.
For a long time, I was raised Catholic, but rejected that when I was 14, decided I didn't believe in God, and for a long time was happily on Team Secular. But over a long period of time, I've come to think that actually both of these worldviews, over a long period of time, I've just come to think that both of these worldviews are inadequate. Both of them have things they can't explain about reality. And so this eventually led to this book, pointing to the difficulties with both the God of traditional Western religion on the one hand, and also the meaningless, purposeless universe of secular atheism on the other, and exploring the much neglected middle ground between those two extremes. And also, finally, exploring the implications for human meaning and purpose.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And why do you say you wouldn't have seen yourself writing this book 5 years ago? What's changed?
What has changed? I mean, I always try to follow the evidence where it leads, and which is hard to do. I mean, I guess I really want to know the truth. I really want to, we'll never know for certain, but I just really want to have our best guess as to what ultimate reality is really like. And I suppose a big thing was changing my mind on the question of cosmological fine-tuning. This is well, I guess we can get into it, the surprising discovery of recent decades that for life to be possible, certain numbers in physics had to fall in a quite narrow range. So, I mean, the example that's most puzzled cosmologists revolves around dark energy, the force that powers the expansion of the universe. Once you do the calculations, it becomes apparent that if that force had been a little bit stronger, everything would have been pushed apart so quickly that no two particles would have ever met. We would never have had stars, planets, any kind of structural complexity, and therefore no life. If that force, however, had been a little bit weaker, it wouldn't have counteracted gravity, and the whole universe would have collapsed back on itself a split second after the Big Bang. So for life or any kind of structural complexity whatsoever to be possible, the strength of that force had to be like Goldilocks porridge, just right. Not too strong, not too weak. So I always felt this needed explaining.
Absolutely.
Like many scientists and philosophers,
Sure.
It just seems too improbable that this is just a totally wild fluke. But for a long time, I thought that, like many, that the multiverse was the best explanation of this. That probably there's just huge number of universes, each with different numbers in their physics. Some gravity's stronger, some gravity's weaker. In some, the universe accelerates faster, and some slower, and so on. So that at least one universe is going to fluke the right numbers for life. If enough people play the lottery, someone's going to get the right numbers. So that just seemed to me the more plausible explanation. But I was persuaded by philosophers of probability that there's just some dodgy reasoning going on, and you just cannot deal with this phenomenon in terms of multiverse. And so I was just dragged kicking and screaming into the idea that what this is pointing to is some kind of goal-directedness at the fundamental level of reality towards the existence of life. And that's weird, and it doesn't fit with the picture of science we've got used to. And I mean, I think, to be honest, that's why as a society we're kind of, I think, a little bit in denial about it. Maybe it's a bit like in the 16th century when we first started getting evidence that we weren't in the center of the universe, and people couldn't handle that. People struggled because it didn't fit with the picture of reality they got used to. And nowadays we sort of scoff at those people. Oh, those idiots. Why didn't they just follow the evidence? Stupid religious people. Yeah. But I think every generation absorbs a worldview they can't see beyond. And I think it's a little bit like that with fine-tuning now. I feel a little bit silly talking about this cosmic goal-directedness. I kind of call it cosmic purpose, because it just doesn't fit with the current moment, what people think is how science ought to be. Sure. But we should follow the evidence where it leads, and I honestly believe that's where it's currently pointing.
Wow, very cool. And I was thinking about the start of this conversation where we'd start. I want to start with panpsychism, but since we're already on this kind of thread line, the book. One quick question: Are you familiar with Bobby Azarian? Have you read the Romance of Reality?
Oh yeah, we had a bit of email contact. Yeah, I've read some of it. Yeah, it's very interesting.
I highly recommend reading it. It's a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. I've interviewed him a couple times, and he is on a very similar track in mode of thinking. And he has this, this thesis, like the universe it's like a universal Darwinism, Bayesianism, and so like our universe is one of probably this part of some kind of natural selection of universes, and ours is one that happens to have life. But he rejects also the multiverse, because what it seems to do is explain away kind of a lot of the issues and not really give them. It doesn't seem to simplify things at all. One, it seems to make things actually more complex. It seems to go against Occam's razor, but it's a very and he has kind of a similar idea about this cosmic purpose. But I want to ask about you specifically in your book. What is a cosmic purpose? I think you use the term purposivist, a cosmic purposivist. And how does one live like one?
Yeah, cosmic purposivist. Yeah,
purposivist. Sorry, that's a tough word to get out.
No, I don't know. Maybe I've just made that word up, so I don't know how it's pronounced. Let's just decide now how to pronounce it.
Oh, you made it up.
Officially, I don't know. Maybe
that's why.
I think maybe it's been used before. I hereby declare that it should be pronounced cosmic purposivist. But,
got it.
Who knows? Yeah. So, I think, and I think you're right. Actually, I mean, I think there has been. I mean, one interesting thing that I think in science there's been emerged recently some challenges to the reductionist picture of science. You know, I think science for a long time has been dominated by this very reductionist idea that it's really physics running the show. And so, you know, everything in our bodies and brains is totally determined by the arrangements of particles. If anything is not fixed by that, then it's just quantum randomness. But I mean, I used to again, I've changed my mind on a lot of things. I used to sort of take that as the dominant view that surely must be established. But the more I talk to kind of neuroscientists, the more I talk to condensed matter physicists, it's not clear that is an established view. It's not clear we really know enough about the body and the brain in order to know that there aren't some certain forces operative that only kick in at kind of higher levels of complexity. And there have emerged a number of scientific positions challenging that. The assembly theory of the chemist Lee Cronin and the physicist Sarah Walker. Kevin Mitchell, the neuroscientist, is arguing that the free will of conscious organisms has a role to play in determining what happens in the brain. Now, none of these these are not necessarily connected to the idea of cosmic purpose, but there's a connection, at least in that challenging that sort of reductionist orthodoxy. But yeah, so cosmic purpose, I mean, so just fundamentally, I think, coming back to the fine-tuning, I think we face a dilemma, right? Either it's just an incredible sorry, something stuck in my throat tonight. Either it's just an incredible fluke that the numbers in our physics are just right for life, and I just gave you one example. There are many examples.
Yeah, there's 7 numbers, I think, or up to 20. I don't know.
I mean, there are varying figures people put in it, and there's controversy around the edges. I think but this isn't a fringe view. I don't think there are many physicists saying, "Oh, this is all just a load of nonsense," right? There may be disagreement along the edges, but yeah. So either it's just a wild fluke, or the numbers in our physics are as they are because they are right for life in some sense. In other words, that there is some kind of directedness towards life in the early stages of the universe. And, well, how do we make sense of that? I try to explore a variety of hypotheses to try and make sense of that. So that's a sort of working project, how to accommodate that basic idea of cosmic purpose. And yeah, but I think that seems to be where the evidence is pointing. As to how it affects human existence, I guess that's another story. I mean, so most of the book is just a cold-blooded scientific case for cosmic purpose, cosmic goal-directedness, regardless of what impact it has on us. So, my colleague David Hume said, talking about this, said, yeah, maybe you've got a reasonable case there, but I don't care. I make my own meaning. That's fine, and that's a perfectly valid response to most of the book. But I suppose in the first and last chapters, I think about the implications for human existence, exploring possible connections with cosmic purpose to spiritual practice, spiritual communities, even political struggle. And ultimately, I come down on a kind of middle way. I always go for the middle ways. I hate the dichotomies. So you got one extreme, the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig, who says, if there's no purpose to the universe, it's all meaningless, pointless. We should just kill ourselves or kill each other or murder, whatever the hell you want. The other extreme is the typical secular humanist position. My colleague I just referred to has, who cares? I make my own meaning. It's irrelevant whether it exists or not. I think there's I take a kind of middle ground option that I think we can have perfectly meaningful, valuable lives, regardless of cosmic purpose, by pursuing kindness, knowledge, creativity, and so on. I had a perfectly meaningful life, I like to think, before I came to take this stuff seriously. But maybe if there is cosmic purpose, or if there is a reasonable prospect of that, then maybe there's hope that our lives could be more meaningful. You know, I think we want our lives to make a difference if you can contribute in some small way to the purposes of the whole of reality. That's about that's huge. That's about as big a difference as you can imagine making. So I suppose I've come to find cosmic purposivism a deeply meaningful way of engaging reality, framing your existence. You know, partly this is I agree with William James that you only live once. It's rational to an extent to hope beyond the evidence. We'll never know for certain. And I'm not trying to dogmatically lay down the law, you know, this is the only way of living a life. But maybe what I'm trying to present, I suppose, is a way of thinking about the meaning of life that is different from the familiar options of religion or secular atheism. And people might think, hey, that sounds cool, might be worth a go. So
that's one of the things I pulled. Thank you. Yeah, and that's one of the things I pulled out of the book. And one of my favorite quotes, I have a bunch of things I liked, and your writing style is great, was that true ethics is a concern to make reality better. And I really pulled that out. And I think, and actually this is a question I had, and I'm sure you're not against humanism, but you do have a section there where you put out the soft claim, let's say, that cosmic purposivism is better or potentially more meaningful than humanism. And so I think as you know, as a way to compare contrast, can you like expound upon that idea?
Good. Yes. So what is humanism, I suppose, is a commitment to making the world that we live in for human beings and perhaps for other animals. People are now talking a little bit about sentientism, that maybe the ethical focus should be not simply humanity, but all sentient forms of life. It gets a little bit tricky for a panpsychist, because I guess I'm inclined to think plants and trees are probably sentient as well. But anyway, let's park that for a moment.
We'll get there.
Now
we're going to go there.
That's great, you know, and that's that's a wonderful ethos. And as I say, I don't hold the extreme religious line that, oh no, that's just meaningless unless there's some cosmic point to it all. But, well, as you said, I'd forgotten I'd said that in the book. I need to read it again. That we want to make reality better as much as we can. You know, you don't want your whole existence just to be, you know, making one rabbit a little bit happier. You want to ideally make as many animals as you can happier, or as many people as you can happier, or and if there is some wider purpose encompassing all of that, that would be even more expansive an ethical project. If there is a purpose to the whole of reality, that's as sort of maximal, expansive, ethical and meaningful project. So, and you know, I suppose you do find, it's what's sometimes called the meaning crisis, I suppose. Well, actually, William Lane Craig, who I just referred to, the Christian philosopher, was saying on his most recent podcast, the meaning crisis is driving people to crazy views like panpsychism to try and find meaning and explain these desperate attempts. So that was kind of interesting. I can't imagine who he was thinking of. But we do find, though, a lot of people have not found, I suppose, secular humanism to be enough. Have not found... you know, get to middle-aged, they might have struggled in their career, got themselves where they want to be or not, as the case might be, had children, grown up, and then they think, what's the point of it all? What's the point of it all? And it's not enough just to think about, well, you've made society a little bit happier or something. Want an idea of a broader purpose. Now, look, ultimately, the most important thing for me as scientists and philosophers, I say, this is kind of my catchphrase, we shouldn't be looking for the view we'd like to be true, but the view that's most likely to be true. And, you know, if secular humanism is the best we've got, then we should make it work and run for it. And it's not all, you know, doom and gloom. But I happen to think that the evidence It could change tomorrow. Science has a habit of changing, but the
Mhm.
evidence as we currently have it seems to point to some sort of broader purpose or directedness. And wow, how lucky we are that there is that even hint of that.
Mm.
And as I say, I think it can be rational to somewhat take a leap of faith to engage with that. And I've personally found it a meaningful way of living life in recent years. Keeps my ego in check. It helps me have a broader perspective of not just, my
Mm.
own interests and my family and so on.
Sure. Yeah.
So, yeah, as I say, I'm not trying to dogmatically lay down any line, but
Yeah.
give it a go. See how it goes. Try new things out. What I'm trying to do in this book is I'm always, trying to consider things that aren't the familiar options.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
And
They deserve exploration. Yeah.
maybe it won't catch on, maybe it will, maybe some aspects will. I think that's what science and philosophy is all about, getting new ideas going into the mix, see what bubbles up.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And one thing that quote maybe kind of think about and led me down a train of thought was, and again, the quote is, "True ethics is a concern to make reality better." I think that the term there is reality, or this world. And what it got me thinking about was, some people, maybe you feel that maybe you're like this as well. They love nature. They love being out in the wilderness, hiking on trees and plants, and you feel this connection to the natural world, right? And don't get me wrong, like a panpsychist that took this position, cosmic purposivism, might feel that same thing anywhere they go. So if you're in your apartment, you're in a room right now, and if you could feel that the room you're in, the objects that are there, that there's some degree of consciousness there, like I feel like you could have that same amount of wonder and awe potentially in your everyday life, just anywhere you go. And what's interesting about, and I've heard, I've read some of your work and listened to you on some podcasts, is with the panpsychist idea, and I know that there's like even subsets within panpsychism, so people differ across the board. But you seem to go most of the way, but not all of the way. So you say sometimes, like, you don't think the rock is conscious, or you don't think a cup is conscious. And I say, why not just say they're conscious? Why not just say, I mean, I get that the intuition is that they're not. But if you go a little bit further and say that they are, might we treat them, say, in that kind of romantic way in nature, where we are treating like reality as all experiencing, and then we treat it sort of the best way? Does that make any sense? Does this all resonate? I don't know.
No, absolutely. Yeah. It's really interesting. I mean, just on the point of walking in nature, don't we feel that connection with the forest and the plants and so on? And does that make sense if they're just unfeeling mechanisms? It's hard to square that, isn't it? That, if we're just engaging with mechanisms, it doesn't. So I think our normal relationship with nature makes a lot more sense on a panpsychist worldview. And, I've speculated in my work about what it would be like for a child to be raised in a panpsychist worldview and see the plant as a conscious organism and its movements as expressive of its feelings and desires. And if you watch plants sped up, actually, it's much easier to ascribe consciousness to them. Walk through a forest, seeing it as a sort of buzzing, blooming community. And actually, the more we've learned about the interactions of trees underneath the ground, we really do get much more of a sense of their character and mental life, sharing information, warning signs, preferential treatment to their kin, whilst also cooperating across species, the evergreen trees, sharing nutrients in winter with the deciduous trees that's reciprocated in summer. So, humans struggle to cooperate across ethnic lines, but we've got these trees cooperating across species. But sorry, I'm digressing slightly.
No.
Yeah. As for inanimate objects, well, there are big divisions in panpsychism, as you say, and some panpsychists, like Luke Roloff's, do think literally everything is conscious. And these tend to be the panpsychists who have a very reductionist picture of things, where really all there is just conscious particles, and what we call Carlos's mind is just the word for a complex combination of conscious particles. You're just a kind of bundle of conscious particles. And then if you do think that, then, well, there's not much difference between, there's no sharp boundary between a brain and a rock. It's a question of degree, right? It's a question of arrangement, and we'd have to ask the question, okay, which slight change, if we imagined changing a particle at a time to make, I have a paper talking about this actually, particle at a time to change a brain into a rock, what would be the point where the lights go off and it stops being conscious? So if you've got kind of Luke Roloff's position, then everything's conscious. But of course, the rock doesn't have the kind of consciousness a human being has. It hasn't. Its consciousness is not the result of millions of years of evolution that's evolved the brain to process information about the environment and govern behavior and function in such a complex, systematic way. It's just going to be some sort of pretty meaningless mess. But I guess my panpsychism, as I hinted at earlier, I'm more and more opposed to this reductionist story, which reasons I kind of go into in the book, actually, making sense of the evolution of consciousness. And so I'm more inclined to a kind of panpsychism where consciousness comes in layers. So you've got kind of consciousness at the level of particles or fields, the level of cells, molecules, then cells, large parts of the brain itself. And if you have that kind of layered view where these new layers of consciousness come with their own dynamics and their own forms of behavior, then it's going to be less common. There's going to be more quite unique specified conditions whereby particles combine to form a system with unified consciousness in its own right. And I'm inclined to think natural selection discovered and exploited those conditions, and so probably the living world is teeming with consciousness, but probably rocks and socks and tables and chairs are not. But still, I mean, just finally, I do think we can still have that optimistic vision of reality that you pointed towards, because I think in a panpsychist worldview, we are conscious creatures in a conscious universe. We're in a universe that's like us, that's in a sense in solidarity with us. And so it is, to emphasize again, that's not why I take it seriously. We should look at the arguments and the evidence. I think there's a good case for panpsychism as probably true because it's the best explanation of how consciousness fits into our scientific story of the universe. But I also think it's a picture of reality which is maybe a little bit better for our mental and spiritual health.
So there's a bit of an effectiveness argument. It could be useful in a way, and that's a question of the different definitions of truth, right? So there's a pragmatic truth, and sort of like if it's, But you are trying to get to be as close to objective truth as possible. And
that's my particular philosophy. I suppose I'm very much. I'm not sure how I could argue for that, but I'm very much not a pragmatist, unlike my hero William James. I do think there's an objective truth out there, and we'll never know it for certain, but we can have our. And it's not like, if you ask me how confident I was in panpsychism, I think it's more probable than not. But I'd probably say 60% certain or something. And so all we can do is have our best guess. But that's what keeps me awake at night. Just I want to have our best guess. We have me and on my podcast Mind Chat I do with Keith Frankish, who has the polar opposite opinion of me on consciousness. So I think it's everywhere, he thinks it's nowhere, and he has this nice thought experiment of the truth demon, right, to test how serious you are about truth, right? Suppose the truth demon is gonna asks you, that what's the reality, what's the fundamental story of reality, and if you give the wrong answer, the truth demon will send you to hell for eternity. So, there's really the pressure to have your best guess. So I think, that is a good way of getting in the mindset of all the ego where you want to be right and you don't want to, be the view, you want to stick to the view you've always held and the view which associated with your culture and your team or whatever. And just whether you're a Catholic or a humanist, and just try and have our best guess at what reality is like.
And if I may, I just want to refer back to what I was referring to with how we treat reality, how we treat just inanimate objects. And this is a few months back. It was this past summer. I was outside playing with my nephew. He's 9 years old. And he'd taken some fallen sticks off of a tree and was whacking the sticks against the trunk of the tree, right? And I mean, he's a kid. He was just doing it. And I told him to stop doing it. I was like, don't do that. And he retorted back, like, why not? Like, what am I doing? It's not like, I actually think he referred to it, because I've told him not to like step on ants, don't kill ants if you don't have to. There's no reason to. They're just not doing any good. But the stick thing got me, and it hit me in a different way, because I felt like, and yeah, this is a little bit out there. But I felt like it was disrespectful almost to be taking the fallen sticks and whacking it against the trunk of the tree. Like, it's like, in case the tree is conscious, or in case there is even the stick itself, it's like the question of like, why kick rocks? Is how I think about it. It's like, there's not really a whole lot of reason to kick a rock. And in the off chance that you're hurting said rock, don't kick it. And it's a weird thing, but I wonder if it might make you, one, treat reality a little bit better. There's also a little bit of a corollary with when I was, and you said you're raised Catholic, I was also raised Catholic. And I want to talk to you about Pascal's wager in a bit. Because, you talk about it, I believe, in the book. You go into it talking to a priest about it, and you didn't get confirmed, I believe, sort of not over that alone, but I do want to talk about that. Because Pascal wager actually worked on me in high school. But I had a chaplain.
More time. Yeah, but we can. Go.
Well, I want to return to that. The chaplain in my high school, I went to Catholic high school, and he was brilliant man. I respect him so much. And he had this kind of use case argument for not just for ourselves, but also for objects. So something like a cup, this wants to be filled. It wants to be used. Clothes in your closet, they want to be worn. And I'm sure some people can relate to this, that when you look at stuff you have in storage, or you look at an old shirt you haven't worn in 5 years, and it feels like a shame because it's not being consumed, it's not being used, right? And I think if we had a frame of mind, even though it's out there, that the shirt feels a certain way to not be used, it feels neglected, it feels like that might be potentially useful. It's like, how do we handle the world with care is kind of where I'm getting at. And it's an out there idea, but when I think about that more, I think, oh my goodness, I have so many things to attend to, so many things that should be more utilized in my life. So does any of that resonate? Does this, I think
it's interesting thinking about I don't think your nephew would be hurting the tree necessarily by hitting it. Maybe pulling the leaves off if it's not autumn. I don't know.
He does that too. He does that also.
To think about what's although it's, the more and more, this comes back to my wrestling with veganism. I'm sort of, I kind of have a vegan preference, but if you don't think plants and trees are conscious, you've got a nice, clear moral cutoff line, right? I'm not going to eat the things that are conscious. But if you think plants and trees are conscious, and you can't avoid harm. Even if you don't think they're conscious, you can't avoid harm. And so I suppose what we have to try and inculcate is just maybe an attitude of respect and reverence, and try to create a world in which all organisms on the whole flourish, even if there is suffering as well. We try and minimize, and as many as possible live free and flourishing lives. And I mean, your factory farming, which is I think bigger in the US than it is in the UK, but is more of a concern to me. I actually call myself a humanitarianism. So I eat small amounts of animal products where I'm confident that they have the better, fairly high ethical standards. And my vegan friends say, well, there's still harm, even in the best farming. And that's no doubt true. But if more people did buy animal products very, very carefully, even when you buy chocolate, when you buy candy or whatever, with the highest ethical standards, then I think that would impact the market more, would drive down factory farming, which is the worst offending thing, more than a smaller amount of the population being vegan. Anyway, there's a big argument there.
No, sure.
But yeah, I do think a sense of reverence, a sense of respect, and I think that can extend even to inanimate objects. I'm not inclined to think inanimate objects themselves are conscious, but I think they are constituted of universe-wide fields that are conscious. I mean, so I often talk about panpsychism like particles, but most theoretical physicists are more inclined to think our world is made up of universe-wide fields, and particles are just sort of local excitations in fields. And I think panpsychism runs better, actually, thinking the fundamental forms of consciousness are these universe-wide fields, and you've got unity at the base. So even your shirt and the rocks are fluctuations in these universe-wide fields of consciousness, and so we should have respect and reverence for all things, and try and avoid the them and us partitioning that so often dominates human thinking. I just care about my family. I just care about my family. I just care about my nation. I just care about my group, whether it's a religion or a secular movement or left or right or whatever. And that's what's so wonderful about panpsychism, about cosmic purposivism. It's very Copernican in a sense. It's sort of expanding away from all that to a huge, all-embracing picture of reality. So it's hard to meet, but it's maybe something to aspire to. Yeah,
sure. And I'd love to get, sorry, now that we went to that kind of place, that territory that I took us, if we get more a little concrete, I'll try to, it's something you mentioned a few moments ago, and the delineation. I'd love to know that paper too that you wrote that you'd mentioned, like if you change just a few constituent parts, like when does...
Oh yeah, do you know how I set it up actually? I set it up as the biblical story of Lot. Lot's wife got turned into a pillar of salt. For daring to look back at her city burning to the ground.
That's right, yeah.
God said, how dare you look back as you're leaving your home forever, become a pillar of salt. So, no one doubts our creator's benevolence. But I imagined, what if God did it kind of one particle at a time? What point was the consciousness cut off? And I mean, with most things, there's that question that puzzle doesn't arise because there's a vague, fuzzy area. Like there's no exact penny or cent where you go from being poor to rich, right? There's no exact minute when you go from being young to old. There's no exact hair that you lose that is makes you go from not bald to bald. It's a slow, painful process that I'm currently undergoing. But with consciousness, it's not clear to me it makes sense that there could be a fuzzy boundary of, like, does it make sense that a friend of mine, Eric Schwitzgebel, great philosopher, different view to me, but he thinks it's indeterminate whether snails are conscious. So it's not that they're conscious. It's not that they're not conscious, that they're just unfeeling mechanisms. There is no fact of the matter as to whether they're conscious or non-conscious. Just like, there's no fact of the matter as to whether I'm bald or not bald. I'm in that fuzzy image. With consciousness, I think that doesn't make sense. I mean, either the snail has feelings or it doesn't. It doesn't.
Yeah.
And if that's right, then we're going to need these precise cutoff points, and that's sort of hard to make sense of in terms of thinking about the chemistry of the brain. What exactly is the point that the straw that breaks the camel's back? And actually, this is something which the integrated information theory is partly motivated by, trying to get these sharp cutoff points. Anyway, I've interrupted you with a wild digression.
No, that was a good. I like that. And that's IIT was something I was going to ask you about as well, and we will get to that and talk a little bit relation to Hoffman and Kastrup even. But I think this goes into this point, sort of the combination problem. So there seems so talking about panpsychism, and so it seems to be simpler, but it doesn't explain it, to say. And I think most materialists, most people in the world would say consciousness is an emergent phenomena, right? And we just haven't figured it out yet. Now, panpsychism does a few great things in helping resolve that issue, but still has the explanatory gap of the combination problem. How do these conscious atoms or conscious particles, how do they come together to create and form what you might say is different levels of consciousness? Our consciousness is different than a snail's, right? So can you make sense of that? And how? What's your stance on sort of panpsychism helping resolve that combination problem?
Good. So this is really where is seen, I suppose, as the biggest challenge to panpsychism, and is where the energy and activity of contemporary panpsychist research community is focused. And there's lots of incredibly interesting proposals. And I mean, one thing I could say is we've put so much time and energy into solving the problems of materialism or physicalism, and got precisely nowhere over many decades, whereas it's still quite early days in addressing the panpsychist combination problem. So I think it's reasonable to sort of take a bit more time on that. But I guess the view I'm more and more inclined to is that this problem is really only a hard, serious problem if you have a very reductionist view of reality, where really everything's just conscious particles, and what we call tables and chairs and animals and plants are just labels for certain complex arrangements of conscious particles. Then you've got a deep problem how with just conscious particles coming together in certain ways, you somehow make a system with its own unified conscious experience. So there are certain philosophers working in that very reductionist story. Luke Roloff's, I think I already mentioned, his excellent book Combining Minds. He does some really interesting work thinking about whether split brain cases can help us understand this phenomenon. David Buelis, who is a panpsychist philosopher at Princeton, who has a radical kind of spinocistic monism, where in some sense there is only the one conscious mind that is the universe. And I kind of struggle to make sense of that. I think, hold on, surely my mind's different to your mind, and that makes two minds. I don't know. Maybe I'm too simple-minded. Maybe I haven't meditated enough. But as I say, I'm more and more inclined, just talking to scientists, actually, realizing how, when I was studying graduate school in philosophy, philosophers of mind get this impression, we really understand the brain, And I think we get overexcited with brain scans. But you have to remember, every pixel on a brain scan corresponds to 5.5 million neurons. It's very low resolution. We're only 2/3 of the way through getting a connectome for the maggot brain with its 10,000 neurons. Never mind the human's brain 86 billion neurons. Yes.
It used to be 100 billion. I don't know. Where did we lose 14 billion?
Yeah. too much drinking. Basically we understand the basic chemistry of the brain. how neurons fire, chemical transmissions, and so on, how that all works. We understand a lot about large-scale functions of the brain, but we're almost clueless on the in-between bit, how those functions are realized at the cellular level, how it works, how it works.
Yeah.
We're pretty clueless about that. So I think we've no idea whether a sort of reductionist story is true, whether everything that happens in the brain is reducible to underlying chemistry and physics. That's or to put it another way, whether chemistry and physics is the same in organic systems as in inorganic systems. So as I say, Kevin Mitchell questions that, the assembly theory questions that. And I think, well, one thing I try to press in my new book is evolution. Thinking about the evolution of consciousness gives us good reason to question that reductionist paradigm. There's a really underappreciated mystery here, making sense of how consciousness evolved. Because natural selection just cares about behavior, right? It's only behavior that matters for survival, how you behave.
Mm-hmm.
And with the rapid progress in AI and robotics, it's become apparent that you can have incredibly complex behavior and information processing without any kind of inner life at all. And so the question is, why didn't natural selection just make survival mechanisms, very complicated mechanisms that can mechanically track features of their environment, initiate survival conducive behavior without having any kind of inner life at all? For any behavior associated with consciousness, there could have been a mechanism that does the same job. So why did consciousness evolve at all? That's a deep mystery. Or rather, it's a mystery on a reductionist story where everything is just fixed by physics and it's just irrelevant whether or not consciousness pops up at higher levels. But if you reject all that reductionist story, if you accept that, well, no, when conscious understanding, when there emerges organisms with conscious understanding of the world around them, the ability to freely respond on the basis of that understanding, maybe that opens up radically new forms of behavior, radically more conducive to survival than what you get just from physics alone, what you get from just sort of mere mechanisms in mechanical interactions with the environment. I think it's only by making these assumptions that conscious understanding and maybe human agency opens up radically new forms of behavior that are more conducive to survival, that we can make sense of natural selection's interest in consciousness. I have a piece in Scientific American coming out on this next week, and so I develop in my new book a radical kind of panpsychism aimed at addressing both the philosophical and the scientific problems of consciousness. But just to finally finish, that was a bit long-winded. Come back to your question. I think what when you're in this kind of radically non-reductionist story where consciousness comes in layers, these new layers come with their own dynamics and behavior, I think the combination problem kind of goes away then, because we're accepting that it's just each layer of consciousness is in a sense a new creation, a new layer of reality with its own properties, its own characteristics. Again, this fits with the assembly theory, which conceives of a kind of memory that develops in the physical world. Then it's not clear what the combination problem is anymore, because we're already accepting that there are these sort of new features of reality that emerge. So it's just, I think it's not clear at that point what the problem is anymore. So I'm less and less bothered about the combination problem as I've embraced this less reductionist view of the world and seen it as scientifically quite plausible.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Is panpsychism, is it compatible or incompatible with emergentism?
It depends what you mean by emergentism, I suppose. If by emergentism you mean the idea that consciousness is not at the fundamental level of reality, that consciousness emerges from the non-conscious, then clearly that's inconsistent with panpsychism, that has consciousness all the way down. Philosophers like to distinguish between strong and weak emergentism.
Mm-hmm.
So weak emergentism is usually what people mean when they talk about, oh, I think consciousness is emergent. They just mean, in some sense, there's just the bottom level goings on, and what we call consciousness is just the name. It's just the name for some complex arrangement of particles or fields or something. The physicist Sean Carroll very nicely articulates that. I recently had a public debate with Sean Carroll
Yeah,
that you can
I
view
saw
on
some of that. Yeah.
my Mind Chat podcast, which was quite good fun. Very, very heated, very spirited. So that's that very reductionist kind of weak emergentism that some panpsychists embrace as well. They want to reduce everything to conscious particles. But I'm more inclined to what philosophers call a strong emergentist position, where actually, as we get more and more complex systems, radically new forms of consciousness and forms of behavior emerge. And we can imagine natural selection seeing, as it were, I'm personifying natural selection for ease of exposition, seeing these new kinds of consciousness which have these new kinds of behavior that are, wow, these things are surviving really well. These radical new forms of behavior, they survive much better than just the kind of the mechanisms over here. And natural selection thinks, I want a bit of that, give me some of that. So so that's my more anti-reductionist, strong emergentist kind of panpsychism. But panpsychists can go both two ways on that. There are radical different forms of panpsychism. There are some panpsychists who take it in a more spiritual direction. There are some panpsychists who are ardent atheist secularists who say, let's get rid of all that stupid religious nonsense. We need to be hard, proper science. Maybe a little bit like the division you had in the early psychoanalytic community between followers of Jung and followers of Freud. So actually, panpsychism is blossoming into many different schools and varieties as it becomes more prominent in philosophy and in parts of neuroscience.
Absolutely. Okay, great. I have a lot of questions to ask you about the book specifically. But before we get there, I think you've already mentioned a couple of these folks. I did want to, maybe we could kind of do this rapid fire as quickly as we can, because I want to get into the book a lot. The comparing and contrasting your views with, I guess, some folks people might be more familiar with, like Donald Hoffman, let's say, and I've had him on this podcast, 3 times as a guest, which is amazing. And he also wrote a blurb for your book, which is awesome. And could you compare your views to his, how he sees the universe?
Good. I like Donald Hoffman a lot. We're good friends, and his view is super fascinating, and so I'll share some disagreements about it, but just to say first off, it's a super fascinating view, and I'm so glad he's doing what he's doing, and we want different people to try different things. Like my Mind Chat podcast host Keith Frankish, who's pursuing illusionism, that consciousness, at least in the sense what I mean by it, doesn't even exist. I think we want people to be trying out lots of different options.
I don't get that. The consciousness is that one.
Well, he would want a nuance that he would say. I mean, consciousness. He would say, I believe in consciousness, but what he means by that is a purely behavioral notion of consciousness, not just external behavior, but the behavior of bits of your brain. A sense of consciousness you can capture just in terms of how stuff behaves. And to my mind, that's not what we really mean by consciousness.
Yeah, I think they're just changing the definitions at that point. It's okay.
I suppose he thinks to the extent that we're inclined to think consciousness is something more than how stuff behaves, then that's the illusion. But it does seem to me changing the definition, because I suppose when I say my wife's in pain, that's not a question about how she behaves or how her inner parts behave. It's how she feels. And that's just a very different kind of claim. Anyway, but Hoffman. But I mean, there's a lot more commonality with me and Donald. But we both think reality at the fundamental level is made up of consciousness. We published our first pop books in the same year, 2019. So there's that commonality. I suppose where I part company is, I think his view that the physical world is in some sense an illusion. How he characterizes it, as with that the physical world is like icons on a desktop or something like that. So my panpsychist view is more the physical world is real. It's really out there, light is bouncing off things, and it's just that it's constituted of consciousness. So, and I mean, I guess I have disagreed with his two arguments for that. So he's got his evolutionary argument that we've evolved for survival rather than truth. So we shouldn't trust our senses to be telling us about the truth. And also his well, just to take that argument for starters, I suppose like a number of philosophers, I do have the worry that it's self-defeating. There's a philosophy paper published on this. So, if we're not allowed to trust us that our senses tell us about reality because they evolved, well, how do we know we evolved? We only know we evolved by using our senses to learn about reality. And so it sort of seems to be well, you can look at Donald and I debated this on my podcast for a long time, and you can judge which side is right. But I do have that lingering worry about that. It's a difficult issue. But the second issue is, where Don appears to physics that seems to show that space and time are quote unquote doomed. But I wonder if it's careful enough to distinguish there between whether space and time exist or whether they exist at the fundamental level. So as far as I can see, and actually Sean Carroll, well, I organized I've got this 3-year grant to try and work out if the universe is conscious, and we had this conference in the US a couple of months ago with Sean Carroll and Donald Hoffman there. Cool. This was Sean Carroll's objection as well that I kind of share, that this physics is suggesting, and it's of course controversial, it's sort of one area of quantum gravity, but it's fairly popular. It's pointing to the idea that space and time don't exist at the fundamental level of reality, so space and time are emergent. But it's not saying they're not real. It's just saying they're emergent. And so it's completely compatible with tables and chairs really existing, just that they emerge from a more fundamental reality. So in those 2 points, I suppose, is where I disagree with Don. But we've been back and forth about this a million times, and it's good fun. That's what you want to try and get in. I love trying to get in the mindset of people who disagree with me, trying to see where they're coming from, and that's get over your polarization, and this is all what it's all about. And I've just realized I was supposed to give you a quick fire answer, and I gave you total
the next
opposite
ones.
of that.
No, the next ones you can. But I like Don. Don's great. He's and I'm a big fan. So it's interesting. I have to go back. I'll have to listen to and I'll link to it in the description for folks interested. Your Hoffman, when you had Hoffman on your podcast, because I got to listen to that. I am a big fan of his fitness beats truth theorem. I've actually I did a 3-part series on my YouTube channel explaining it. So I'm a big fan of that. And actually I think, and he of course has, I forget what it's called, the conscious agent dynamics, which he's trying to get for space-time to emerge using, I believe, Nima Arkani Hamed's amplitude-hedron, sort of like through that, which I talked about with him on our third interview, I think, or maybe the second one, which is super interesting and theoretical. And but it's interesting because I find his FBT theorem is his strongest argument. But yeah, I'll have to listen to that podcast. So next, we'll do these in short order because I do want to have as much time to talk about the book. Bernardo Kastrup. Can you compare your views to his?
Again, Bernardo's got a really cool, interesting view. His attempts to, think about the emergence of biological minds by analogy to disassociation. I've got an undergraduate student doing the dissertation on that with me at the moment. So it's a really cool, interesting view. I suppose, to what extent, I'm not clear the difference between our views in one sense is anything more than terminological. Bernardo seems convinced there's a crucial difference here, that, he thinks that again, inclines to think that the physical world is somehow just appearances in consciousness. Whereas I would say, no, the physical universe is real. It is conscious, but it's not clear. I don't know whether there's anything, whether these are just two different ways of saying the same thing. So I'm not, I think Bernardo has more of an idea that, I don't know, you know, this Monty Python sketch where there's this huge split between the, what are they called? Oh no, the Judean People's Party and the People's Party of Judea or something. The two rebel factions, and they hate each other. Oh, we're not the Judean People's Party. We're the People's Party of Judea. Or I've probably got that slightly wrong. And so Bernardo's sort of like, we've got wildly opposing views. I'm like, really? Is that? But then when it comes to the specificities, I suppose I'm not clear. I'm sort of maybe slightly disagreeing with motivations. He's totally convinced that you get consciousness where you get life and nowhere else. And I'm never clear what his argument is for that. He's always sort of just totally. It's so important for his view that's and I've never understood what his argument for that is. And I think with the dissociation stuff, which again is a really cool idea, but I'm not sure how much work it does, because I don't think you know, the combination problem is usually framed as this kind of explanatory gap, right? How do you get entailments from particle consciousness or universe consciousness or whatever to human consciousness? And okay, even if disassociation is a kind of point where new consciousness emerges, I don't think that in itself closes any explanatory gaps. It's maybe an interesting example where we can kind of give independent scientific support for some sort of emergence of less fundamental consciousness from fundamental consciousness, and that's kind of an interesting data point. But I would say it's just one data point among many. We could look at split brain cases as well. We could look at neuroscience more generally in the attempts to track the neural correlates of consciousness, all the proposals there. We can look at things like what I referred to earlier, the idea that we can know that consciousness is not vague. It doesn't make sense for consciousness to be indeterminate, and that can give us guidelines for assessing theories of consciousness. And actually, that's a worrying feature of Bernardo's view, because it looks like the boundaries of life are vague. So if the boundaries of consciousness can't be vague and the boundaries of life are vague, it's a problem for Bernardo's view. So whereas Bernardo just really hangs a hell of a lot of weight on that single data point. So yeah, they're the two things in the details where I'm not so sure I get Bernardo's motivation. But you know, it's great all these things are going on, and you know, it's just great how panpsychism and related views have gone from just not on the table to probably still a minority view, but a kind of serious option that's published on and taught to our undergraduates and so on. So yeah, I love having the diversity of views.
Yeah, with regards to Kastrup, it's interesting because I've read one of his books and I've listened to him on podcasts, and I feel as though about 5% of the time I'm thinking, this is brilliant, this is amazing. But 95% of the time, I have no idea what he's talking about. And I can't parse it out. And, you know, the difference between those, like, am I just not smart enough to understand this? Or is there just it has to be communicated in a different way, perhaps? I'm not sure. But what's interesting is that where he ends up, his conclusions, I go, yeah, all right, I can kind of get behind that, or I can understand that. But the way he gets there, the way he navigates there, I'm just completely lost. So
I think with Bernardo, he's got his single very specific view that he's sort of totally certain is correct, and I suppose I'm more of a disposition. It's early days, you know. Let's try different options. Let's see what's. And and he actually wrote a quite strongly worded blog post about me saying Goff changes his mind all the time, which I suppose he hasn't really thought about stuff. But I kind of think that's, to my mind, that's a virtue. You know, it's like, you know, who knows what the truth is? We should try different options, and my views developed. And you know, whereas Bernardo says he thought about it for a very long time and he decided what the truth was. So I suppose there's a difference in approach there, but
in style. Yeah,
but yeah, different. But I think that's good as well, actually, to have
Yeah.
some people who just doggedly go for one particular view, and then
Yeah.
some people who are trying different. So I think that in itself, I'm not. It sounds like I'm slagging him off, but I don't know if that's a
No.
expression.
Yeah.
Slagging him
It's
off.
different in style
But
too. He has a
yeah,
firm
it's.
kind of position, and that it's something I have to do a better job of, is not.
If you look at
Oh, sorry. Is
No, I was
trying to
just gonna.
separate.
Sorry.
Oh, after you. Sorry, Philip. Go right ahead.
Oh, just quickly, if you look at the people who like Bernardo, I think they tend to all agree with him. If you look at the people who like me, they always disagree with me, which I love, and I love
Yeah.
that sort of.
Now, as we're nearing the end, let's get into the book finally. But we've talked about topics that are interwoven in this book. But I want to. So you had this idea, and I can lay out in the description of this video the chapters of the book, so people can get a sense of kind of where you're going. And you have two chapters, second and third chapter here: why science points to purpose, why consciousness points to purpose. And one thing that I wasn't able to square away, and I think actually you even mentioned David Hume, the is-ought problem in the book. So for folks who don't know, it's this concept that you cannot derive an ought from an is. And this, when I discovered this, actually destroyed one of my sort of guiding principles in life. And the idea that I thought that if we understand the world better, we'll know how we should act within it. And I do think in a soft way that still generally kind of applies, or at least is useful. But how do you square the is-ought problem with science and consciousness pointing to purpose?
Good question. Yeah, so I do think Hume was right about this idea that you can't derive facts about good or bad or right or wrong or what you ought to do from cold-blooded empirical facts about the world. But what I point to in my book, actually, was one of the most transformational discoveries, as it were, of my life at graduate school, was I think Hume undermines himself by infringing this principle, because he also says reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions, right? By which he meant what you ought to do should be shaped by your desires, by what you want to do.
Yeah.
And he meant, of course, there's no sort of facts about what you ought to do, but that in itself commits a move from an is to an ought, because he's basically saying, if you desire to be a philosopher, you ought to, I don't know, study hard or whatever, go to grad school. That's moving from an is to an ought, because the desire is a fact about you, and it's deriving an ought from an is fact about your desires. And what this made me realize is actually value claim is a much more pervasive than we realize. It's not just sort of murder's bad and stuff. It's claims like value claims around evidence. You should follow the evidence, which I've said a lot of times today. That's an ought claim. That's a value claim. Or if you're in pain, you should take a painkiller. That is a kind of ought claim. And so, whilst I accept the is ought distinction, I think value claims are so pervasive that it's really not sustainable to get rid of them. I mentioned in the book Bart Stroemer, who's a Dutch philosopher who's a friend of mine, who's a value nihilist, doesn't think there are any facts about value, but he's incredibly bright and wonderfully consistent about this. And he realized that he can't consistently believe his own position, because he thinks quite plausibly that to believe something, you have to take yourself to have a reason to think it's true. You can't believe something and say, I've got no reason to think it's true. I believe this, but I've got no reason to think it's true. But he doesn't think there are reasons, because reasons are a sort of value claim. There's a logical connection between reason and ought. What you ought to do is what the balance of reasons points to. So what he says is the arguments point in that direction, but he can't consistently say, I believe that. So I just don't think it's sustainable. But if you accept the is ought distinction, as I do, if you want to have value facts, you've got to put them in from the start. So I do ultimately think I have something like Plato's view that there are eternal, timeless facts about value, just as there are eternal, timeless facts about mathematics and logic. And that's, again, weird, hard to make sense of. How do we know about these things? How do they, impact our brains? This platonic, timeless realm. And the best I can say, which is what I say in the book, is we've got the same problem in maths and logic. That the wonderful Nobel Prize winning physicist Roger Penrose has talked about a lot. He talks about the three realms: the mathematical, the mental, and the physical. They all interact in strange ways. How do mathematicians, through sitting in an armchair thinking about it, penetrate and discover things about this eternal realm of mathematics and logic? I don't know what the answer is, but my hope is whatever the answer is to that can also give us an answer to how we know about timeless truths about value. But so ultimately, I do think there are these timeless truths about value, and because of things like fine-tuning and making sense of the evolution of consciousness, I think somehow those timeless truths about value play a role in shaping the physical universe in a way that's hard to make sense of, but I think that's where the evidence is pointing.
Interesting. And let's go into, if we could dive into one specific portion, chapter 2, Why Science Points to Purpose. I was quite excited, and I think this is, I'm not sure if it's in the dive deeper section, but you bring up Bayes' theorem, which how could you not if you're talking about probability? And, one thing I'm quite confident in is that most people, even myself included, improperly understand probability. And we don't update properly, even though our brains are, doing some pretty good Bayesian probably estimations on their own. But I'm sure you've seen, like when people are polled or when people are given, basic Bayesian probability questions, we screw it up all the time, right? Doctors that think far more people have a disease or far fewer people have something than they do, and they're given very simple, straightforward probabilities. But I will say, I have to be honest, I didn't quite follow the section, the reasoning behind where you end up with why, using Bayes' theorem, why panpsychism makes more sense than materialism. Maybe that's not the claim you're making, but that's what I thought you're going for. And I thought, okay, this is great. I think this will make sense. Or maybe it was with fine tuning. I'm not quite sure. But can you expound on that idea? Can you explain that?
Cool. Yeah. Well, I hope this is one of the most accessible introductions to Bayes' theorem, actually, more as much as anything else. So yeah, as you say, I'm trying to fit two audiences here. I try to have a more accessible bit to each chapter and then a sort of digging deeper bit where I get into more technical details. But I don't think I was given a Bayesian argument for panpsychism as such, but for cosmic purpose, for this goal-directedness idea.
Sure, yeah.
So the way you think about in Bayes' theorem, I mean, the basic idea is what you do is you ask, how likely is the evidence on various hypotheses? So that's what always confuses my students, that you're not asking how likely the hypothesis is, you're asking how likely the evidence is. And I mean, just to make that clear with an example, I suppose, suppose we've got DNA evidence that Joan is the murderer. We're trying to work out, did Joan do the murder, or did Bill do the murder? And Joan's DNA is discovered all over the body. And we think, that's really strong evidence that Joan did it. What's going on there? And as you say, our brains sort of do this automatically, and Bayes kind of worked out mathematically what was going on. What we're doing is we're saying, assume Joan didn't do the murder. It's really unlikely that her DNA would be all over the body, let's say, because she wouldn't have been anywhere near the person. Assume she did do the murder. It's really likely that her DNA will be all over the body because she'd be strangling the person or whatever. So, in other words, which hypothesis is supported,
right,
depends on which hypothesis makes the evidence more likely. Right. That's the hypothesis we should go for. That's the basics of Bayesianism. So now think about the fine tuning of physics and The numbers. So I mean, I think ultimately what is so striking about the fine tuning is that the numbers that have turned up in our physics are those that are compatible with our universe containing things of great value. Life, intelligent life, people that can fall in love and write poetry and contemplate their own existence. Whereas if you explore the probability space, that's incredibly rare. Most of the universes you get generating the other numbers, spinning the numbers differently, as it were, have little or no value. A lot of the universes just have hydrogen in the simplest element. There's not little or no value in a universe containing hydrogen. Okay, so we happen to have the numbers in our physics happen to be in this rare range that's compatible with a universe of great value. Okay, so that's our evidence, right? And now we compare two hypotheses, right? One hypothesis where there is cosmic purpose, there is some goal-directedness towards value, facts about value. Or let me start that sentence again.
That's good.
So that's our evidence. Now compare two hypotheses. So what I'm trying to do in the book is pin down what is the minimal hypothesis that fine-tuning supports. Some people use it to support God, whatever. What is the minimal hypothesis? And what I come down to is what I call the value selection hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that okay. So one thing I'm trying to do in the book is pin down the minimal hypothesis that fine-tuning supports, right? Some people use fine-tuning to support God fiddle the numbers to bring about human beings. Sounds very kind of anthropocentric. What is the minimal hypothesis what is the minimal hypothesis fine-tuning supports? And what I come down to is what I call the value selection hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that certain of the fixed numbers in our physics are as they are because they allow for a universe containing things of significant value. So that's the value selection hypothesis, that there is some kind of directedness towards value. I explore a range of ways of making sense of that. Contrast that with a more typical irrational picture of nature where there is no directedness towards value or anything of value in the fundamental workings of the universe. Contrast those two views, and now we ask, how likely is the evidence on each of those views, right? So assume the irrational view where there's no directedness towards value. How likely is it that the numbers in our physics would be as they are, namely compatible with the universe of great value? Incredibly unlikely, right? You just have to do the calculations. That falls out of the physics. But then how likely is the evidence, the values that we find in our physics, if this value selection hypothesis is true, if there is some directedness towards value? Well, much more likely these are the kind of numbers we'd expect if the selection of those constants was influenced by considerations of value, because we find that the numbers in our physics are in the rare range compatible with a universe of great value. So the evidence that we find in current physics, it could change tomorrow, but the evidence as we currently find it is vastly more likely on the value selection hypothesis than it is on the irrational conception of nature. And that just falls out mechanically then, once we apply Bayes' theorem, that the evidence of fine-tuning vastly supports the value selection hypothesis over the irrational picture of nature. So, the value selection hypothesis sounds really odd. It's not science as we're used to. Like, how can value be playing a role here? But this is the wonderful thing about having Bayes' theorem. It's not just about debating our intuitions, what feels right to us. We have this bit of mathematics we can apply. There are still debatable points. I go into as many objections as I can think of in the book. If you're thinking of your own objection here, it's probably in the book considered, and I will give my response so you can judge for yourself how well my response is. But we have this bit of mathematics to discipline the discussion. And on the face of it, it's that Bayesian approach seems to deliver the result that fine-tuning supports the value selection hypothesis.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, thank you for explaining that, because I got a sense that's what, should I say this? As I was reading it, I could sort of follow the argument, but I could not reproduce it myself. Like I could not, you're sort of back, you're looking at the data, you're looking at the evidence, and then you're going backwards. You're sort of, you're like rebuilding the crime scene. If I could, I don't know if there's any other way to kind of look at it. You're saying,
Yeah.
what is most likely given this? You're kind of working backwards. But I
I
still
mean, I've
think,
just got,
oh yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
No, go on.
Oh,
I
no,
mean,
I was going to move on
oh,
to
sorry.
another topic, but we done
Which
this
is
a couple.
funny. I mean, that was very complicated, but we can simplify it by just
Yeah.
saying, well, we've got this choice. Either it's just a fluke, or there is some directedness towards value. I mean, fundamentally, that is the choice that is presented to us.
Yeah.
So that's a more simple way of making the point. Is it, look, the numbers in physics happen to be in the narrow range that allow for value. Is that a fluke or not? That's a more simplified way of making the same point, essentially.
Gotcha. I just want to be mindful. Do you have just a couple more minutes time-wise, or how tight are you?
Yeah, a couple more minutes, but probably unfortunately. We could have another conversation some other time. Unfortunately, I'll probably have to go and.
No, I understand. I've already taken
get
much
through things before.
So,
the other thing is with having kids as well, you've got to gives you a sharp cutoff point for work.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, at the very end, I can say, oh, these are things I didn't get a chance to cover to sort of pique people's interest maybe in the book. But one thing I definitely want to just put a little bit in here is, and you get to it about 3/4 of the way through the book, although I think that there's reasons why you don't rely on this area too much, is around psychedelics, because the psychedelic experience, the mystical experience, let's say, it seems much closer to a panpsychist view when you're experiencing it, or as people say, the experience that they have, than it does a materialistic kind of a view. And I feel like it's one of the stronger arguments that we can have that kind of experience for panpsychism. Can you comment on that at all? Like, do you agree with that sentiment? Or, I mean, I know there's this pernicious, because to rely too much on that is, you want to have a cold-blooded argument, as you say. But I think the fact that we can have those kinds of experiences definitely lends credence to the panpsychism.
I think I would probably, I think there's something to what you're saying, but I would probably do it a little bit the other way around. I would probably say, if you're a panpsychist, you can be more open to taking psychedelics more seriously and what they seem to be telling us about reality. So, I don't know, I guess psychedelic experiences are quite varied, but there are often reported experiences of the idea that there is some kind of consciousness or living presence, as it's often described, at the fundamental level of reality. Now, if you're a materialist or a physicalist, you just have to think that's a delusion, right? Because it doesn't fit at all with your worldview. But if you're a panpsychist and you already think on independent grounds that there is consciousness at the fundamental level of reality, then it's not so much of a leap to think that you're having some kind of access to that fundamental kind of consciousness in these kinds of esoteric experiences. But yeah, I mean, I talk also about, again, my hero William James, who has this view that, if we all think it's okay to trust your ordinary sensory experiences, there's a cup in front of me right now, but that could be a delusion. I can't get outside of my consciousness and check whether my conscious mind corresponds to reality. But we think it's okay to just trust that it does. So James thinks, well, it's a sort of double standard if you think it's okay to trust your ordinary experiences, but it's not okay to trust what psychedelic experiences seem to be telling you. And if anything, people who've had psychedelic experiences say those experiences seem to them more real than their ordinary non-psychedelic experiences, even after they've ended. So I do think that a case can be made for the rationality of taking those experiences seriously. And I mean, just more generally, I think psychedelics are hugely important. They've been used for hundreds of years, if not millennia, for spiritual advancement, and it's just insane that they are criminalized. And I mean, they're dangerous, but lots of sports.
Oh yeah.
We allow people to do it dangerous. I think there's a strong case, and the mental health benefits that the recent research has shown are immense. So I think there's a strong case for decriminalizing, for allowing use of psychedelics in controlled circumstances. I always say I don't think we would have had Brexit in the UK if we'd have had psychedelics, and I think they're just a hugely important tool for spiritual advancement. And I wonder whether part of the banning them is politically motivated, and the whole idea we have now of the 60s revolution as sort of silly hippies, tree huggers, and that whole way in which we're trained to think about views like panpsychism until fairly recently, whether that partly has a political motivation for discouraging views that are encourage people to think outside of the box and sort of outside of the sorry, let me phrase that again, because I sort of stumbled off it. Whether there's a political motivation there for giving a negative spin on these kind of views because of worries about where they're going to go politically. You might, if you're thinking in Bayesian terms, you might put it in terms of prior probabilities. So you always have your prior probabilities, what your probability ascriptions before you come to the evidence. So suppose if you're a panpsychist, you have a much higher prior probability for the kind of things. Sorry, if you're a panpsychist, you have a much higher prior probability for there being some kind of higher form of consciousness at the root of all things than a materialist would. So you can take more seriously the evidence of the mystical experience.
Gotcha. I know you have to go, so I just want to run down a few things that I didn't get a chance to ask you about, but just to maybe pique people's interest potentially for a second round. One, your experience, there's no particular order, but your experience on the Joe Rogan podcast. I kind of wanted to hear what that was like, what that experience like, how you're raised Catholic, and Pascal's wager. We didn't get a chance to go into that, but that really had a huge influence on myself, and still kind of percolates. I'm not totally convinced it's a terrible argument. Your opinions on your favorite Black Mirror episode, your opinion on Squid Game, which I heard you talk about, you quoted as brilliant but terrifying on a podcast. The concept of what breathes fire into the equations. It's a classic, I forget who said it, which philosopher, but also the appendix chapter is taxation theft, which I thought was interesting, an interesting inclusion in the book. The concept of tukdam, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's where Buddhist monks, after death, their bodies don't decay, or they don't decay for a very long time. Yeah, it's a really interesting, mysterious phenomenon. Pilot wave theory, Bohmian mechanics. I want to ask you a little bit about that. And also the link, I forget who it was, the researcher who is trying to potentially look at the link between autism and panpsychism. So there's a couple of topics. I mean, I know time's limited, so we didn't get a chance to talk about, cover everything, but maybe a teaser for another time.
Oh, we're going to have another conversation, aren't we?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm the first person to link Squid Game to the problem of evil and God's existence. Yeah.
Yes. That is maybe my favorite chapter. I think probably my favorite chapter in the book was the chapter 4, Why the Omnigod Probably Doesn't Exist. That one really, I got to say, that one struck me really hard. And I agreed with almost everything in that chapter. I mean, maybe everything in that chapter.
Wow. So yeah, this is one of the problems. I'm arguing both against God and secular atheism, so everyone ends up hating me. So,
well, I like you, and I'm sure the audience will too.
I hope people come to it and feel challenged, even if they don't end up, and have a little bit of a different perspective, even if they don't end up agreeing with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I like you a lot. This is a great conversation. People pick up the book. I'll link to it in the description for people to purchase. And thanks again, Philip. This was a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much, guys. It's been lovely. Let's do it again.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.